Hello, my name is Lisa DeFranza, and I'm the cultural curator here at Art Ovation Hotel. Welcome to the Transparencies exhibition. So this is the beginning of the Transparencies exhibit. This is the Florida Watercolor Society exhibit. All these artists are from Southwest Florida, and all of them are using the medium of watercolor in really different ways. I think you'll see that as we move ahead. This artist, Kathleen Dirt, lives in Tampa. She's a former president of the Florida Watercolor Society, and she's a really interesting artist. We have a couple of different types of work here from Kathleen. This piece here is representative of a technique she was experimenting with at the time. She used gesso, which is usually used as an underbase for a painting, as her background. So here she has orange, yellow, and white gesso as a background, and the face layered in on top of that. Kathleen is very interested in color and how color affects emotions. She also really loves watercolor because it's so fluid and it really does its own thing. You have to kind of let it run its course. So she has a very interesting mixture of letting the watercolor drip, you see that right here, but also having a lot of control. So she is capable and brave enough to leave white space and work with a dryer brush so that she doesn't saturate the paper entirely. Here you can see really great examples of Kathleen's experimental use of color. She has all these purples in the faces and all this sort of colors next to each other. She always prefers to put colors next to each other as opposed to mixing on her palette. To her mind, it activates the viewer's eyes, and that's what really makes her paintings sing. These two pieces are from Old Havana, Cuba. She went to Cuba and she was very interested in women posing in colonial garb for tourists. So she wanted to catch these women in non-posed positions. And she was really touched by this whole thing. She always paints from emotion. That's what drives her and inspires her to work. So these women are captured in her paintings in a really elegant and beautiful way, I think. This is the work of Terry Denson, who lives in St. Pete, Florida. And you can see already that Terry's use of the watercolor medium is really different from Kathy Durden's upstairs. Terry likes to paint large and wet. She saturates her whole paper, so it's already, there's no white space like Kathy had. And you can see in her backgrounds that the colors bleed into one another, and she loves that. Terry lived for a long time in the Southwest and also in the Caribbean, and she thinks the Caribbean really affected her color palette. And you can see that here in the deep reds and greens. These two paintings, Night Grapes and A Touch of Ripe, are very indicative of Terry's portfolio. She was known as the sea grape queen for quite a while because she painted so many paintings of sea grapes. When I asked Terry what inspires her to paint, she said very simply, the shadow on a leaf. And you can really see that here. She's very carefully observing how the light hits the leaf in these paintings. Terry spends a lot of time along the Hillsborough River, and she loves to follow birds. So these paintings are aptly titled, Which Way? And Through Here. So she followed the birds and really started to explore the arched backs of the birds, the arched shape of the trees, and the birds' beaks. And her exploration became about shapes that relate to each other. This is the work of Jerome Chesley, who's the current president of the Florida Watercolor Society. We worked closely with him to create this whole exhibition. Jerry is very obsessed with patterns, as you might see in all of his bowl paintings particularly. So one day he went into a china shop and he asked the woman who owned the shop if he could spend the afternoon rearranging the bowls and taking photographs for his paintings. Luckily, she was an artist, and so she said, have at it. And this series came out of that visit to the china shop. Jerry has a really interesting technique. he uses what's called a resist material, which is sort of the consistency of rubber cement, so it prevents liquid from getting to the page. So he begins by putting resist material on the spaces where he wants to keep white on the white paper. Then he'll do a wash of a color. Then he will put the resist material on that color, say it's the light yellow, and do another wash, and so forth. So it's a series of layering. Of course, what that means is that Jerry's planning has to be impeccable, because he has to know that this peculiar shape here would turn out looking like a reflection. He also reminded me that anytime you want to change something in a watercolor, you have to really coat and saturate the whole ellipse, for example, right here. So if he wanted to change something in here, he'd wet the whole ellipse, get the change done, so it wouldn't have any streaking. So each one of these paintings represents a really meticulous, well thought out, planned process. There's none of the dripping that we saw, for example, in Kathleen Dirt's work upstairs. He has control over the entire painting. Before Donna Morrison was a watercolor painter, she was a graphic designer. So she can put together her compositions really rapidly on the computer, and she does that. That's how she works, and she then transfers the images that she creates on the computer onto her paper. You can see that, I think, really clearly in this example. In this painting, you have kind of an out-of-focus guitar and an in-focus guitar. She also is very influenced by Norman Rockwell. You can see that in this whole series of street musicians. She loves painting people doing their thing and loving it, just like Norman Rockwell did. This is the work of Mary Louise Ringers. She grew up in Long Island, New York, and she moved to Florida, and when she did, she said her palette entirely changed. So you can see this is really sunny Florida work. You can see this best represented probably in this, Just Another Day in Paradise. What's interesting here also is that these are all giclée prints. With the exception of this painting behind me, all of these are prints of original work done on watercolor paper, so they have the same texture and feel as an original watercolor. It's an inkjet process that many painters use, and I think Mary Louise uses very, very successfully. This piece right here is Mary Louise Ringers' probably signature piece. It's actually a giclée print of the original. And she created it by putting together a series of photographs. And as she was painting it, she realized when she got to this point right here that this shape is actually the reflection of her mom's head from sitting in a boat. She didn't know that until she started to paint it. And when she painted it, her mom had passed away about 2 years before. So she really felt, as she was painting it, like her mom was visiting her. And hence, she kept the original of this piece, and it's probably her most precious painting that she's ever made. She loves to paint the natural world. She's painted Selby Gardens quite frequently. And right now, she's living in Sarasota and painting Sarasota. As I mentioned before, we see so many different uses of watercolor in this Transparencies exhibition. This here is the work of Lippitt Jones, who lives in St. Pete, Florida, and she has an entirely different technique from all the rest we've seen today. She works on a surface called Yupo, which is a plastic. In other words, it does not absorb the water, it repels the water. So she has to accommodate that and work with that. You can see her technique really well in this painting. She begins by creating a background, and she uses all kinds of materials to create backgrounds. She uses cardboard boxes, she uses plastic coffee cup lids, palm fronds, anything she can find to give her backgrounds texture. And she always starts with the background. Often, she doesn't even know what she's going to paint in the foreground. The background itself inspires her. So she takes that background, and because the surface is water resistant, she can actually swipe the paint off the background. So in contrast to the watercolors we've seen in the upper floors, the paper absorbs the paint. The Yupo repels the paint. So she can swipe, and here you can see she swiped away the background and then painted over it. So she plays with an entirely different process. Lippitt grew up in Texas, in San Antonio, Texas, and she spent a lot of time in Mexico. So the colors of her paintings, she says, are very much affected by all the bright Mexican art she saw growing up. And you can see that in several of her paintings. What's very fun to observe in a lot of her paintings is how the background textures get featured in each painting. Sometimes they remain background, and sometimes they come to the foreground. So what's really interesting to observe in Lippitt Jones's paintings is how she develops each painting and works with the background she's created. So for example, in this painting, Touching Up, you can see that the flamingo's body is actually created by part of the original background she developed when she first started the painting. Each one of these paintings represents that technique. She sometimes uses watercolor crayon to outline a subject. She sometimes stencils on top of her background. She's courageous when it comes to using all kinds of tools and materials to create textures you rarely see in watercolor paintings. Thank you for joining us on the tour of the Transparencies exhibition. We hope you've really enjoyed the work of these Florida watercolorists and that you come back to see more tours at Art Ovation Hotel.